So hello everyone, welcome to the Dark Style podcast series. It's our sixth episode, and today we've got ActuallyAdu.
Hello.
Could you share us your journey into politics and civil issues, and more specifically, why did you get involved in political commentary and video essay kind of things?
Well, I I've always kind of been like humanities minded growing up. That was always kind of my thing. So I've always liked history. I've always liked politics. I've always liked economics. So it was always kind of an obvious choice to kind of be interested in that stuff or pursue that stuff. So and then I think when I was like 13 or 14, I was like watching Isaac Butterfield,
Yeah,
maybe
yeah,
younger
same
than
here.
that, or maybe older. Yeah, yeah. So like very like basic social commentary, like oh, I hate feminists, oh, I hate SJWs and that kind of stuff. Yeah, like but other than that, I wasn't really like too in deep that kind of space yet. And then like I started watching this guy called Secular Talk.
Yeah, okay.
Who's this guy called Kyle Kulinski runs it, and it's kind of just like a left of Democrat. He's an American, right? And he's like a left of Democrat kind of commentator. And that like he was a funny guy. To me he seemed like he was getting it straight, being honest, cutting through the bullshit.
Yep.
And importantly, to a guy who had already kind of watched Isaac Butterfield and was kind of sick of the not sick of, but just like mind you, I disagree with this. I'm just saying it from the perspective of me when I was like 15. Um, quote, sick of the, softness and snowflakery of the left. This guy was like, he made it a point to be like anti-idpol. Um,
So,
which I have my reservations about nowadays, but that's kind of what got me into like left-wing politics. Um, and then yeah, just kind of from there, just reading more and watching more, I guess, more informative content as opposed to more like commentary and just like reacting content. Um, and yeah,
yeah, cool. So you said you align your policies somewhat left wing. But going on to that, you said that you were opposed to the snowflake and kind of weak attitude of the lefts. So, do you align more like closely with like social conservative ideas, or
oh
are you
no,
still more of a
absolutely no.
moderate?
This is what I was like.
Yeah.
No, this is like when I was like pretty young. Like
Yeah. Okay.
I was like yeah, really young when I was talking about that stuff.
Yeah.
Now I'm probably like the most woke communist you could think of. Like I'm very much socially progressive
Yep. So
and that kind of stuff.
your economic beliefs and social beliefs are both quite progressive and left wing.
Yes,
Yep.
yes.
Cool.
Nowadays, yeah.
Yep.
Just back then, that was kind of like a formative thing.
Yeah. Okay.
Which a guy, a teenage boy, kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
Particularly when you had that like alt-right pipeline present. Not saying it was good; it was bad. Um, but that's kind of the reason I think. But thankfully, I'm out of that now, or at least in my view, I'm thankful I'm out of that. Yeah.
So, what are you hoping to achieve with your platform, and in what ways have you gone about achieving your goals?
So in Australia, I feel like there's a bit of a lack of far left content creation or effective propaganda. So you've got your friendlyjordies. You've also got like your uh, a bit old now, but Harvey Yemeni. Um, you've got your this is a bit more niche, but you got your Toffer Fields. You've got like these kind of general pariahs, but I don't think there's much in terms of like the as far as I would want to go in terms of certain policies or things. So my aim is to kind of bring that to kind of the forefront in Australia, Because in the US, for example, there are quite a bit of those like I mean like Hassan is obviously like the biggest example of where he's like a relatively um quite a left-wing guy and he brings a lot he kind of normalizes a lot of those maybe bigger and scarier topics to a mainstream audience. And I'm not that, and I don't know if I want to be that, but I'm like the guy who, after you're kind of, in a few months, into a few months, like watching political content, you're kind of a bit more aware and informed. I'm the guy you then come to afterwards to kind of refine your views and maybe like establish a bit more of a stable and a better framework. So I'm not the guy who starts at the top of the pipeline, but I'm like somewhere in the middle. That's kind of my goal at the moment.
Yep.
And so I don't talk necessarily in like entry level terms or like I'm not super accessible to like apolitical people, which is something like I want to work on. But I think my role at the moment and what I'm growing to be is that kind of like intermediary,
Yeah.
like,
Okay.
okay, you've kind of stuck your teeth into it. What now? So I think that's kind of my short-term goal for now is to kind of fulfill that role in Australia on the further left. Because yeah, I try and make all my content about or relevant to Australia in
Yeah.
some way.
Yeah.
Because yeah, I think there's that kind of like discourse or that perspective lacking.
Yep. Probably the biggest question today. It's probably already been partially mentioned. But what is
Yeah.
the biggest issue in Australia that matters to you, and why do you focus on that issue specifically, like compared to the various other like issues that are out there?
Housing. Housing is the number
Housing.
one issue
Yep.
of our, yeah, 100% number one issue in Australia, number one issue of our generation. Just because so many other things surround housing in this country. Like there's so many other issues that relate to housing. Like housing is like the bedrock of like what's stuffed up about this country. Like from the start of colonization, the way we treated land to now, how we treat land and how we treat housing, it's just so fundamental um, to how our economy and how our politics have been shaped. So 100% for me, housing is the number one issue. And I mean, it's one of the basic essentials of life. Everyone needs a house, everyone needs a roof over their head. So I think those two facts alone just kind of make it such an obvious topic for me to kind of center or hone in on. Particularly because housing is such an important issue in Australia, there's so many opinions and there's so much propaganda and there's so much um, you know, shit being. Am I allowed to swear on here?
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay, okay. There's so much shit being flung to the wall about like housing or whatever, and I think what's really lacking is a like systematic, comprehensive, coherent analysis of housing in this country, both how it's become like it is today, what it was in the past, and also like what we can do from here, like what we can actually do to maybe address some of those real problems. I think that's sorely lacking in Australian discourse, particularly with like I see so many like pop econ books and like 700 word articles. Oh, how we can solve the housing crisis, and it's like it's just all of them feel like very incomplete, very inadequate. Um, and so I really want to kind of yeah, elevate the discourse in that regard.
Yeah. Why do you think the housing crisis has developed in your perspective?
So, um, housing like land in Australia has always been it's unique in Australia how much we've treated land as like an asset that we can speculate on. So as early as like the 1820s, we've had like banking crises surrounding like pastoral land and speculation and overextension of financial institutions into that, right? Like it's so embedded into our like we enclosed First Nations people's land into privately owned parcels of land for like free settlers. So this kind of like expansionary speculative attitude is like so embedded into our like national psyche, into our culture. So even before like the modern kind of causes, this is already something that's comparative to other nations, something very unique. Um, in terms of like what we can pinpoint the modern housing crisis on, I think it started when Robert Menzies, um, through a bunch of very extensive, like government heavy programs and policies, increased the home ownership rate from, I think, below 50% to above 70%. And this was done through, you know, really tightly regulated mortgage markets, really generous homeowner grants, first home buyer grants. Like literally, if you fell under a certain category, you could buy a house for £5. Like that is ridiculous, right? Even back then, like that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
Um,
But it'd be argued
so
that that,
from
that
that, make
policy was to expand the opportunity for people to obtain housing, especially after the Second World War.
well, what I would say is that it was successful in the sense that it increased home ownership from below 50% to above 70% between 1950 and like early 1970s. However, when you treat homes like, because ultimately what the government did was they effectively built and financed homes and then they sold it to the private market, right? And so while they, you know, built it and financed it, ultimately it still became an asset um, to the homeowner. And so when you have a huge demographic, 70% of the population who own whose biggest asset is their home, whose largest source of their net worth is their home, they're going to start voting for, campaigning for, being in favor for policies which increase the value or the value of their asset, basically, right? So that's when we get people. That's kind of the base, right? That kind of allows politicians and allows the country to pursue policies which um, increase the value of assets, increase the value of homes. And so that's what we kind of get in the 1980s, where we have this big wave of deregulation, of privatization, of expansion of free trade, foreign banks coming into the country, all this credit coming into the economy, all this investment, all it's going crazy, right? And so we do see a property boom that kind of peaks in 1989, and then with the recession in 1990 comes down again. Um, but nothing was the reasons behind that 1990 recession was the excessive credit flow in the economy after deregulating and all that stuff. Um, but the lessons taken from that wasn't to reverse that or try something else. We kept those policies in place under Keating and then Howard. Instead, they induced one of Australia's worst recessions on record through increasing interest rates to above 20%. And then after obviously inflation went down after that, then they like um, decrease interest rates again. But they didn't do anything about those deregulatory policies. And so what you had um, from Keating and then to Howard into the early 2000s was the beginning or the precipitation of the excessive price growth we're seeing today. And that's been exemplified through the big one is obviously Howard's cuts to the capital gains tax concession, but that's comparative to the stuff that was done in the 80s and 90s. That's relatively minor and just kind of like an additional fuck you to to people who want affordable housing. So yeah, that's a very long-winded way of saying that it started in like the 50s, and those kind of policies laid the basis for people who so for the voting patterns of people who voted in favor of increasing asset values. We got that in the 80s when the neoliberalization of Australia happened. And then slowly but surely, we've kind of gotten to a point where house price growth has become so excessive that's just completely divorced from income and any kind of semblance of affordability.
Yeah. In relation to housing, but also expanding onto other topics, what do you make of the current political landscape, and why do you think it's been so polarized and so unworkable in recent times?
I think it's very obvious that the two major parties are unable to satisfy a majority of the electorate, and that's obvious in their primary votes falling. That's obvious in party memberships falling. And I think a big part of it is the lack of meaning in current society. So previously in maybe older times, you had organizations like trade unions, even religious organizations that people felt like they belonged to, and to some degree represented their wants and needs that acted, to some degree, acted as if they were in their interest, right? And so, for example, with the Labour Party, Gough Whitlam, who is remembered as one of Australia's most ambitious prime ministers, was actually like a staunch Labour right conservative guy in like in the late 60s. But because of the general strike in 1969 and the subsequent um, very intense industrial struggle, general strike after general strike. Even the ACTU was calling strikes. It was like a very intense period of trade union action. That and combined with that was the anti-war movement against the Vietnam War. Combined with that, pressured Whitlam into becoming one of Australia's most ambitious and progressive prime ministers we've ever seen. Um, so people felt like they had some kind of connection to the halls of power, even if they like ultimately didn't. There was still that kind of feeling, I think, and to some degree, if they mobilized enough, it did work. So I think one reason is the lack of meaning in today's society, where people feel isolated, they feel disenfranchised, they feel like the majors aren't representing the interest. And I think, again, yeah, part of that is that there's been this decline in community organizations or representative organizations that do have somewhat direct access to the halls of power. Contrarily, the kind of top class of society, whatever you want to call them, they have the same, if not more, access to the top echelons of power. So they've consolidated their strength, and they're more able to influence these governments. So in like the 1980s, for example, industry was kind of all over the place in terms of like a peak body they had, and they formed the Business Council of Australia, and now that's like a very influential body. Um, so there's been this kind of reversal of like people aren't feeling like they have any stake in society anymore. They don't feel like they have like a foot in the door. Um, and yeah, I think that's a big reason why people are disenfranchised with the major parties. And the knock-on effect is like because people don't have any kind of influence to the big parties that they may have had before, um, they don't feel like they're being represented. They feel like promises are being broken. They feel like their needs and wants aren't being fulfilled. Um, so I think that's one reason why I think.
Yeah. You mentioned that a lot of people don't feel like they have a stake in society, and I mean, you'd probably agree with me that there's been a rise in polarization in the media market as well as many other communities. Do you see like the Australian media driving this, and do you see influencers as repeating the mistakes of the Australian media today?
On the second question, 100% yes. 100% yes. I think so many influencers, maybe not so many, but quite a few are kind of repeating the same kind of mistake of old media. Um, I think,
Yeah, because I've
I
noticed that
think,
you've called out a
oh, yeah,
few
sorry.
individuals, like what was it, friendlyjordies and auspilled. There's quite a
Yeah.
few.
I wouldn't place the blame of like polarization necessarily on our media, broadly speaking. I think in certain like aspects you can. So for example, this is a very local example, but like during the whole Apex gangs like shit in Melbourne and Victoria, when there was like a scare campaign about Sudanese gangs in Melbourne. And Peter Dutton was like, people are scared to go in a restaurant in Melbourne because they're afraid Sudanese people are going to kill them. I think the Murdoch media had a massive role in that. And I think, in certain select instances, media has a big role in causing polarization. So whether you want to talk about Rudd being ousted because of the mining tax or um, Bill Shorten being denied prime ministership in part because of negative gearing. Um, in part, not in full, but in part. Like I think the media has some degree of responsibility in terms of polarization. Um, I think also the media has also been unable to kind of feel representative of what people's interests are. They kind of feel very detached, kind of, halls of power, very much like close to politicians. People don't feel like the media is on their side. I mean, I'm pretty sure, unlike journalists and politicians, among like the least trusted professions in the country. Um, so I think a big reason of polarization isn't necessarily because of like the explicit actions of media, but because they've failed to kind of make people feel as if they can be trusted and that they're representing the public interest. Which again is true to an extent, right? Because so much media um, is bought out by special interests or owned by special interests, and even if they're not, they're still reinforcing narratives that ultimately do serve these bigger interests. Um, I mean, I'm sure everyone's heard of it, but manufacturing consent by Noam Chomsky goes into the media model and how that all works. Um, and while it's a bit dated, I think a lot of it still applies today. Um, in terms of new media, um, I think new media is kind of representative of that shift. I mean, obviously it is because if people weren't listening to old media, they'd be going to new media. So it's not necessarily causing polarization. I think it's more representative of it. It's more of a symptom of it. People are searching for the stuff anyway. Um, and I think where a lot of new media gets it wrong is trying to be, um, trying to be, how do I say it? Because
You could argue how it's they're following a similar path in how they're framing stories and how they're
yeah, yeah.
how they're sourcing those stories and yeah, just how they're representing them.
I think I can't find this quote for the life of me, but I've talked to other people who have reaffirmed this. He said this. Friendly Jordy said he wanted to be the Murdoch of the Labour Party.
Mm.
Um, and again, I can't for the life of me find what podcast clip he said this. But I've talked to Geordie's fans and like, yeah, I remember him saying that. But look, maybe he didn't say it, and I'm making it
Mm.
up, and I'm hallucinating. But I do think he's kind of trying to fulfill that role.
Yeah.
And I think that is ultimately like for someone so introspectively kind of not introspectively um he applied the model Chomsky wrote in Manufacturing Consent to the Australian media landscape so well. Um, for someone like that to then just say, oh, I want to, instead of tearing down that kind of structure, I want to be the one administering it. That to me just seems like completely like you've missed the point then. Um, so I think people like that, I think, are just completely off the mark. Um,
Yeah, but
I think, yeah,
would
a
you
lot of new
say
media, I think
yeah.
they want to, instead of trying to build a counter hegemony. They want to kind of reinforce the current one. But instead of, this section of people at the head of it, they want to be the head of it. And I think that's completely wrong.
Yeah, no, see, I understand that you've called out few of these influences, but do you think that they're taking too much of a role of pushing on narratives and following on from the mistakes of the past? And do you think more influencers these days are not researching, not doing their homework before presenting information?
I think it's a combination of both. I think there's some of them who are willfully misleading people. Um, and I don't want to say names because I am currently being threatened with defamation.
Yeah, I saw that on
Um,
your platform. I was interested.
so I won't say
Yeah.
names because I don't want to get you in trouble either.
No.
But and some I think genuinely believe the Kool-Aid they're drinking. But yeah, I think it's a combination of both where some people they've fallen into this kind of pipeline, um, and no one's ever come up from a debate being convinced unless it's like a very like minor issue or like something they don't have a lot of stake in. And so um, the people who kind of, believe they're true believers, I think they've come to that conclusion from an emotional perspective. And the best you can do is kind of just lay seeds in, plant some seeds of doubt and hopefully and pray that they come to fruition and they grow into maybe them having a better perspective, sometime down the track. That happened with me, by the way. I used to be, again, after my like anti-SJW phase, I used to be, and again, I'm talking when I'm quite young, so this is not representative of me right now, or even in the last few years. But I used to be quite like a Labour you could say shill. I liked friendlyjordies. I was very much a Dan Andrews stan. Um, and I would defend things like his prioritization of the Port of Melbourne, for example, even though in principle I thought privatization was dog shit, but I would defend those things. I'd find ways to defend them. Um, but also, like the things that drifted me away from that was the kind of seeds of doubt that were planted in my mind about the guy and about Labour. It wasn't like one moment where I was like switched off from the party completely. And I don't think it's ever like that. I think there are seeds of doubt that are planted. And then if as long as you're kind of on the right path, eventually you'll kind of grow out of it or you'll grow into something different. And that happened with me. And I think that'll happen, hopefully through my content, that'll happen with a lot of people, whether it be in regards to immigration or housing. So I think that's where the true believers kind of are. It's like it's hard to, yeah, they come from a very emotional perspective. They're very set on their position, and saying to them, you need to think before you speak. You might be right, uh, but that won't resonate. But then the other group of people who I think are willfully misleading the public, who actually do have a interest in pushing certain narrative, like a financial interest in pushing certain narratives. Um, I think that's pretty much what old media did, you know, um, where they would have vested interests or certain interests aligned with um, different classes, which their narratives kind of aligned together, and they had a shared interest in pushing the same thing. I think the same things happened in that regard with some of the newer influences that, um, yeah, that I think are, in my opinion, willfully misinforming the public.
So where do you see yourself in the middle of all this? How do you see yourself rising above this and, being a point of differentiation?
So I openly acknowledge my ideological um, perspective and my bias. I'm a communist. I like Marx. I like all that stuff. I shouldn't say all that stuff. I'm not like a Leninist or I'm not a Stalinist or anything. So very different in that regard. But like I'm quite left wing, so I'm very open with that, right? Um, and I try my best to I acknowledge that I'm pushing a narrative, but I genuinely believe in what I'm pushing for. And I try and I don't just try and have this like overarching kind of capital R revolution goal that I'm pushing towards. I try and apply my framework and way of thinking to specific topics and see if it works, and hopefully convey that to an audience. And um, I try and look at the literature, the academic literature. In all my videos, it's very like chock-a-block full of research and stuff, which is intentional. I want it to be like that because I want my videos to be not only even if it's like if there's disagreement, I want that disagreement to be represented, and I want to explain that disagreement, or I want to say, okay, here's maybe where this perspective maybe a shortcoming. Um, or vice versa. Here is where this perspective is reinforced by the literature in this respect. Um, so I try, like every claim I make, I try and cite it, and not in the way that a lot of YouTubers do. They just kind of flash up a general like article, like specifically in the paper, where in the paper it says it, and in the paper if it has a citation itself, I'll try and find that original source as well. I try my best to be meticulous with it, and I don't always get it right. Um, I think there's been a few videos of mine where I think I could have done a lot better in conveying my point. Um, so I'm not perfect. I think there's times where I would have and should have done better if I had the chance again. But that's the best I can do really. And openly acknowledge I have this perspective, I have this framework, I have this bias. Here's what I've found in the literature. What do you think? That's kind of what I try and promote.
Yeah. Moving on. How do you see the political landscape shaping up this year, and more specifically, the election campaigns from all the parties?
Well, I think it changes like every month. Like a few months ago, I was like, "There's no way Dutton of all people are gonna win the election." Like he's such an unelectable guy. But then, for a while, it was looking like Albo was quite behind. But now, obviously, it's it's flipped quite in the opposite direction. Yeah, it's crazy. Um, so I honestly think there will be a minority government. I'm hoping for a minority government. However, I know that Albanese has like completely ruled out a minority government with the Greens, which I think is just a why? Why would you do that? There's no reason. I don't think Albo has much. If it is a next Labour term, I don't think they're going to win a third term anyway. So I think you might as well, um, get as much as you can in the minority government to come. Um, so yeah, I mean, look, the Gillard government was the most productive government in Australian history, I think, bar the first Hawke government. Um, and if you look at productive prime ministers, Gillard was the most productive prime minister. So the concern around like minor parties gridlocking parliament isn't real. It's actually they're actually our most productive governments in our history. So and many good things came from the Gillard government from a more left perspective. So like I know people are a bit fed up with it today, but the NDIS in principle, I think no one hates the NDIS. It's just the kind of waste and abuse that's associated with it now. But the NDIS, like Gonski, these things that again, like not perfect, but comparative to maybe the Rudd government were better. Um, and I think that's just the best outcome. And I think um, even today, the obstructionism of the Greens is highly overstated. I think there have been many more pieces of legislation that have been passed collaboratively with the Greens, where the Greens have benefited the legislation, than pieces of legislation that were obstructed and fell through as a result of the Greens and Labor disagreeing. So the one big example is the Housing Australia Future Fund, obviously. Um, but even that example, it's like, okay, it was delayed by like a few months, but then what was it like the disbursement cap was lifted, so it wasn't a maximum of 500 million, it was a minimum of 500 million, and then an extra like what $3 billion into social and affordable housing. Again, not much, but it's like if you're talking to a Labor guy who's always talking about like being pragmatic and like doing the best you can in shit circumstances, it's like, well, isn't that the bet like objectively a better situation out of a shit situation. Um, so, and I think despite the animosity and despite the vitriol, I think the relationship between the Greens and Labor this time has actually been relatively constructive. So obviously the HAP is one, but also the safeguard mechanism, the right to disconnect. Um, there's a few other things, but yeah, generally speaking, I think it's a collaborative relationship that is more conducive with better policy and more ambitious policy that I think will satisfy more people. So that's
Yeah,
hopefully minority government.
yeah, yeah. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to be on our podcast. I'm sure we'll be in contact in the future,
Yeah,
whether that's part of the broadcast or coming on the show again. So, yeah, thank you.
yeah, too easy. Thank you so much.
All good, no problem. Have a good day.
Cheers. You too.